Welcome to the Power in Motion podcast, the show for women who want to develop a kinder relationship with their body so you can feel healthy, happy, and confident without restricting food, doing torturous exercise, or constantly worrying about the number on the scale. I'm your host, Kim Hagel, size-inclusive fitness specialist and certified non-diet health and life coach specializing in body image. This podcast is here to provide weight-neutral, health at every size aligned information and coaching on sustainable habits and mindset shifts so you can feel your very best in the body you have right now. Let's lace up our runners and go for a walk while we chat. Well, hey friends, and welcome back to the Joyful Movement Show. We got a special show for you here today. For the last 8 or so episodes, we've been talking here about simplifying wellness and how to cut through all of the confusing and conflicting information out there about health and finding a path that's simple and sustainable for you, where you can trust yourself to make decisions about your health and taking a more holistic approach that really encompasses your mental, emotional, spiritual health, as well as the physical. And today's episode is a bit of a bonus one on this topic. I'm really excited to welcome a very special guest to the show, the woman who literally wrote the book on wellness. I'm joined today by Christy Harrison, a registered dietitian, nutritionist, certified intuitive eating counselor, and journalist who has been covering food, nutrition, and health for more than 20 years. She's the author of 2 books, The Wellness Trap and Anti-Diet, and the producer and host of the podcast Rethinking Wellness and Food Site, which have helped tens of thousands of people around the world think critically about diet and wellness culture and develop more peaceful relationships with food. And today she's here to chat with us. So welcome to the show, Christy.
Thanks so much, Kim. It's nice to be with you.
So great to have you here. I am honored to speak with you and to dig into the trap of wellness with you. And as I said, it's something we've been talking about on the show for the last little while. And it's a hot topic because, of course, everyone wants to be as healthy as possible. But chasing health can feel like chasing this moving target that's always changing and just slightly out of reach. Mm-hmm. And we talked a bit on the show about how it can become a really slippery slope where the quest for health or wellness can very quickly turn into an unhealthy obsession. So why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about your work and what inspired you to write The Wellness Trap?
Yeah, I love that description you said about wellness being something that's, always out of reach and ever shifting and never quite, something we can grasp onto. And I feel like that has been my experience of wellness and wellness culture. And, it's been the experience of so many people I've talked to, whether in interviews for my podcasts or the book or, people I've worked with, clients of mine over the years. And so I think so many people struggle with the notion of wellness that is sold to us in this culture. And that was part of the reason I wanted to write this book. And, another part was that, as I alluded to, I had my own struggles with, seeking out wellness. And really it was driven in large part at the beginning by disordered eating. I was, trying to lose weight. I was engaging in a lot of disordered behaviors and started having health problems as a result and started seeking out help for those problems. And nobody could really figure out what was going on. I went from doctor to doctor. I felt dismissed and unheard and, unserved by the medical system. And so I started looking for alternatives. I started looking into alternative medicine. I started, going down rabbit holes on the internet of pre-social media. This was like in the early 2000s, but, the sort of early days of like forums and message boards and things like that of people with particular conditions, and started self-diagnosing with like a gluten intolerance or other conditions, and, really got myself kind of wrapped up in a lot of problematic pursuits and dubious diagnoses. And that's something that I've seen subsequently in a lot of clients of mine and people I've talked to. And, I think there's now just rampant misinformation and disinformation out there about wellness topics. And I saw that so profoundly in the pandemic. I think for years, there's just been this kind of simmering, growing movement of wellness culture online, and was really abetted by social media. And I was seeing the harms of it in people I worked with who would develop orthorexia, like an obsession with quote unquote healthy and clean eating. But then in the pandemic, I think things just went to the next level in terms of like outrageous wellness claims and, things being promoted that really have no good evidence behind them, and dubious diagnoses and science denial and just all of this stuff, and sort of like the weird nexus of conspiracism and disinformation and wellness culture. And all of that was really fascinating to me. And so, I knew I wanted to write a book about wellness. That was kind of on my list since writing my first book, Anti-Diet. I had a chapter about wellness in there, and I could have written far more about that than I did. And so, that was definitely on my long list of potential book ideas. But when the pandemic hit and I started to see things, how wellness was sort of dovetailing with a lot of these other problems that were coming up in the pandemic, that was something I really wanted to focus on for this book. So that was kind of like how I got there to doing what I do. And I think I bring to the table, not only my personal experience of having gone through disordered eating and recovery and my professional experience as a dietitian, but also this experience as a journalist, learning how to sift through sources of information over the years. And, at the beginning of my journalism career, I was really disordered with food, and I was really looking for alternatives and really open to alternative medicine. But it sort of like came up against my journalistic standards and practices that I knew I had to implement in my work, where, I would see something really far-fetched on some random website, that's now like a true story. There's a website that I used to look at a lot that's now on at the top of the disinformation dozen list of like the 12, entrepreneurs who are spreading the most anti-vaccine misinformation. I was like a big fan of that site for just personal use, and, would find stuff on there that I would like try to research for potential journalistic stories and could never make it happen because there just wasn't any good evidence behind it, And so I think about kind of the tension between those two parts of myself that I used to experience. And, recently have been talking to a number of journalists who experience that same tension of like having this journalistic instinct and understanding what it takes to sort of vet information and suss out good from bad information, and then having this part of ourselves that's like just desperate for answers and healing and wants, what the conventional healthcare system can't give us. So that was definitely a big piece of this too, was looking to like help people apply sort of more rigorous analysis to information that they come across online, while also being empathetic and compassionate for like the parts of them that really desire healing and are so desperate they might not care about whether something is really scientifically validated or not.
Yeah. I think you raise a really important point, right? Is that not everything we experience in our bodies and related to our health can be explained by traditional medicine. So you're not the only one who goes down the path of alternative therapies, alternative health. I've been there too. I've shared a lot on the podcast about my own disordered eating and recovery journey. And it is really hard, even as a person with some nutrition knowledge, to sift through the information and know what's good and what isn't. And a lot of these things have become so mainstream that even if the evidence isn't there, it seems like it's there. Do you know what I mean? Like talking about gluten-free being the best way to eat, or eliminating sugar or whatever the thing is. And it's very, very hard to sift through what's accurate and what's not. And so let's talk about your use of the word trap. How do we end up falling into this trap when we're starting to pursue wellness and find these alternatives and find what works for us?
Yeah, I think it really is a trap because there's so much harm that it does, and it really undermines people's well-being at the end of the day in a lot of cases. Not across the board, but I think for many, many people, it has that effect. And it is such a slippery slope, as you alluded to, where people can, get interested in one wellness topic and then find themselves down this rabbit hole that is far more extreme and, controversial and not backed by good evidence than they might have intended in the first place. And I talk in the book about the role social media plays in that, how it amplifies misinformation and disinformation and radicalizes people and takes them to these extremes where they might come in searching for, a healthy recipe or a workout or something pretty like innocent, not very extreme types of searches, and then end up in these spaces of extreme diets and pro eating disorder content like very quickly.
Mhm.
And so, I think that is a big part of the wellness trap, is that people can get sucked in and pulled to these places that are really extreme, that are not backed by good evidence really quickly. I think too, the machinery of social media and sort of the media environment that we're in now, because it rewards controversy and novelty and things that are going to make people sort of polarized and either be like super in favor or super against something. I think even providers who are maybe practitioners of, alternative medicine or integrative or functional medicine can kind of get pulled into, I think even in the first place, people don't necessarily even get attracted to those things sometimes without exposure from social media or from other groups that are sort of, radicalizing them in that way too. I've talked to a number of people who were healthcare providers of some kind, doctors, pharmacists, things like that, who stumbled into some of these groups online and felt like the shortcomings of the conventional healthcare system that they were experiencing were sort of being talked about in these alternative spaces. And, they felt heard and understood and sort of seen, and they felt like there were answers that they could give their patients, more so than in conventional spaces where some of this stuff wasn't being talked about. And so, that enabled them to kind of get sucked in to a really far degree, to some of these practices that are, really restrictive and potentially really harmful to a lot of people, like unproven restrictive diets, supplement regimens that don't have good evidence behind them, other types of wellness culture practices that are really not evidence-based and that kind of go against what a lot of conventional healthcare wisdom says. And so, yeah, I think it's a really perilous place to be, I think, when you're seeking out wellness information online. And I think like I guess the bait of the trap, if you will, is the fact that like there are these answers being promised. Sometimes it's answers to things that are very disparate symptoms you might be experiencing. For me, like I have autoimmune conditions, I have hormonal conditions, I have digestive conditions, I have skin conditions, and a lot of those are things that wellness culture really promises to treat and prevent, that like conventional healthcare just doesn't always have great answers for. And so, in my sort of most vulnerable states, when I would see something that was like, cut out these foods or take this supplement or, eat more of this particular kind of food or whatever, drink this drink. And, it's going to cure all of these disparate things that are going on for you, from acne to IBS to, autoimmune diseases to hormonal imbalances or whatever. Like that was wildly appealing, because there's this promise of like one and done. Like you do this one thing or you do this one protocol, and it's quote unquote natural and it's more gentle than pharmaceuticals. And it's, maybe more in line with your values if you're someone who is sort of environmentally conscious and things like that. You do this one thing and you're cured. All of these things go away. Like that is extremely tantalizing bait, I think, for many of us who are struggling.
Sure. I fell for it. And I know lots of others who have, and I hear it in just day-to-day conversations all the time. Like this notion that we can heal ourselves from the inside out, right? That it's what we put into our body, and like the talk of inflammation and all of these things that make it sound like, oh yeah, there must be something happening inside of me that I can't see and
Mm-hmm.
and can't touch it. So it must be the foods I'm eating or the things I'm drinking or how I'm moving. And I can fix that. And we're kind of sold this lie that we can fix ourselves if we just do everything right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Totally.
it's kind of like there's that hope that will turn out great for you. But then it, like for me at least, it didn't solve all my problems. So then
Same.
I'm left feeling like, well, then I must be missing a piece. Like there must be something else I don't know, or I must be doing it wrong. And it just became more and more extreme until like I developed an eating disorder because there was nothing left that I could eat.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the path so many people fall down, is like, thinking that you're not doing it right, or that you need to be doing something harder and doing more, and that it's your fault if something's not working. When, we talk in diet culture a lot, in the anti-diet spaces that I've been a part of for a long time, there's a lot of talk of like that the diets are the failure, that it's not you that is the failure. It's not that you didn't do it hard enough. It's not your fault that it didn't work. It's actually that diets just don't work. And I think there's not enough discussion of that happening in wellness spaces, and needs to be. So,
Yeah.
that's part of the reason I wrote this book too, is that we see that so many of these supposed wellness protocols really are ineffective and can also be harmful in and of themselves. And so it's really not your fault if you're doing these things and they don't work or have the intended effect. Sometimes they will seem to work for a time, just like diets, they'll seem to work for a time. Will
Mm.
have these short-term effects. And oftentimes with wellness culture practices, most often really what it is a placebo effect, or, part of this family of placebo effects that is like the beliefs you have about the thing or the intervention, maybe the negative beliefs you have about sort of the opposite thing. Like, if you believe bad things about gluten, you might feel worse when you eat gluten. If you believe that going gluten-free is helpful, you might actually feel better. And that's, it's not to say it's all in your head. There's actually physical pain relief that can come from believing these things. So it's, the mind body connection is strong. There's also something called the care effect that's part of a family of placebo effects. That is when you find a provider who's willing to empathize with you, spend time with you, take your concerns seriously, that can go a long way to helping you feel better. Even if the provider is not offering something that is actually effective, just merely their presence and their empathy can help. But, the thing about the placebo effect is it tends to wear off over time. And so when it wears off, I think oftentimes people can feel like, okay, well, I'm not doing this well enough, or I need to be cutting out these other foods instead. And, wellness influencers and providers can fan the flames of that and can say, oh yeah, this protocol needs to be added to this, and you need all these other supplements, or you need to be tested for all of these things. And, here are these wildly expensive tests that we're going to make you do. And, from non-standard labs or non-standard interpretations of standard labs. And so it can just be this very slippery slope of adding more and more and more things, kind of like the snowball effect, right? And so the snowball becomes bigger and bigger, and you're sliding further down the slope of, this, harmful wellness culture. And so, yeah, I think the solution often is to step back. And this is so much easier said than done, right? Because when you're, again, desperate for answers and someone seems to have them, it's really appealing to just follow that where it leads. And especially if you don't have great help in the conventional healthcare system. But I think, one solution really is stepping back and saying, like, okay, it's not my fault that this thing isn't working. Let me actually point the blame where the blame is due and say, this intervention that I tried isn't effective. It isn't helping, or maybe it's making matters worse. Maybe it's bringing up new symptoms that I didn't have before. And, maybe if it did have an effect, could that potentially have been due to the placebo effect? And considering that, and, considering kind of being open to the possibility that it's not the panacea it was made out to be.
Hmm. Mm. Such a good point. Yeah. Okay, so can we point some fingers? Can we talk about some of the main myths and misconceptions that you see out there in the world and that are kind of the main culprits in the wellness industry? We talked recently on the show about wellness trends that tend to come and go. What are some of the big ones that you aim to debunk in the book?
Yeah, there's a few of them. One chapter that I really loved writing, and I think just because of the way the book was organized, didn't get to come early enough in the book, but that I really hope people read, is the chapter on dubious diagnoses and spurious cures. And that chapter I found really fascinating because I knew some of these things were um, dubious or not something to really be taken seriously, but I didn't know just how dubious until I started doing that research. And dubious diagnoses, what I talk about in the book, and what I mean by that is things like chronic candida or adrenal fatigue or leaky gut syndrome. Those are kind of like the big three that I see talked about a lot recently. And, the supposed cure for those things is like reduce inflammation or improve gut health through all of these diets and supplements, or taking like supplements and sometimes even pharmaceuticals for supposed adrenal function. And all of those things really don't have good scientific evidence behind them. So I thought it was really interesting when I started to look into it that not only are the supposed cures not effective, but actually the conditions themselves really aren't supported by good scientific evidence. And so if you see someone saying like, your chronic candida, this like fungus overgrowing in your body is mold toxicity is another one that's sort of like a related concept to that. But just sort of blaming this like supposed overgrowth of mold or yeast on or for all these disparate conditions that people might have, which, again, is like so many conditions that so many of us struggle with, right? If you have headaches, if you have allergies, if you have, irregular periods or hormonal issues, if you have autoimmune conditions, digestive conditions, skin conditions, all of these things that like seemingly are unrelated, tend to get blamed on these dubious diagnoses. And again, it is so tempting to say, okay, let me just cut out all the foods that I'm supposed to quote unquote supposed to cut out for this, or let me get to the so-called root cause, and treat this supposed condition, and hopefully all of these things will go away. And unfortunately, as many people I talk to for the book can attest, that just leads in a really harmful direction and often opposite of where you think you're going. You think you're going towards well-being, and in fact, it's taking you in the exact opposite direction. So I think, if you see popular integrative and functional medicine people or accounts, or, just influencers on social media who maybe don't have credentials but are influencers in the wellness space, if you see them talking about these things in particular, I think that's a good sign that you're in the presence of misinformation, and to maybe look the other way, look for something more scientifically validated.
Yeah. And so what is the harm that you tend to see come out of these dubious diagnoses? Like, because I mean, I know people are going to say like, but I'm just trying to be healthy, right? And gut health is the hot topic of the day. Everybody's trying to keep their gut healthy, right? So where do you see this going wrong? I guess is my question. As people are trying to pursue health and feel better, what ends up going wrong?
Oh, there's a number of things. I think, probably the most germane for listeners of this podcast, I would imagine, is disordered eating. That if you're someone with a history of disordered eating, or you're at risk of it, it really can lead you down this slippery slope of extreme disorder with food, to be cutting out all these things that you're supposed to cut out for so-called gut health. And, it's really insidious, because it makes, the rhetoric around this makes it seem like there's all this cutting edge science, that is telling us about the microbiome, and that, so-called processed foods are so bad for us, and all of this stuff. Right. And that rhetoric is really powerful. And so even for somebody who's in strong recovery from disordered eating, it can be really tempting, and it can seem almost not connected to the disordered eating. It can seem like, well, this is about health, this is about wellness. But in fact, I think it is very strongly linked and strongly related. As I talk about in the book, wellness culture and diet culture share a lot of the same roots. And in fact, I think wellness culture really incorporates diet culture's main tenets into its foundation. And so, we have to be really, really wary of wellness culture recommendations that tell people that certain foods are bad and then they need to be cut out, and that sort of implicitly or explicitly promise weight loss, or, demonize bloating or things like that, that are actually, demonizing bloating is oftentimes just sort of veiled anti-fat bias. And so, being really mindful and aware that there's such an intimate connection between wellness culture and diet culture, and things that go under the name of gut health are not necessarily about health at all, but are often just, forms of disordered eating that's kind of been made to seem like holier, but actually it's really what, at the root of it is a lot of the same diet culture beliefs that we've been trying to get away from. So, and I think that slippery slope of disordered eating can start with fears around what you're putting in your body in terms of food, but then it can also make people vulnerable to getting really obsessive and, overly concerned about maybe what they're putting on their body in the form of skincare, or, around their body in the form of household cleaning products, or home, decor and stuff like that, right? There's kind of endless things to be obsessed about and worried about. And, to some extent, I think being mindful of like the products they're using, that's not necessarily bad. And, there might be some benefit to that in terms of, environmental consciousness or whatever. But I think it can often get to a really obsessive place really quickly because there's so much fear being induced in wellness culture and so much, fear mongering being used to sell products. And I think the sort of orthorexia around what you put into your body in terms of food can take the form of orthorexia about all these other things. So I think it's really important to be mindful of the kind of information you're taking in and to be aware that, these wellness trends are really dangerous, especially for people who have histories of disordered eating. I think the other piece of it that's so harmful is that, dubious diagnoses can take people away from true diagnoses that can actually help them get the care that they need and deserve. So, things like supposed adrenal fatigue can, that leads people astray into thinking that they need to do this series of things and, take particular supplements or even pharmaceuticals sometimes is recommended by functional medicine people. But if what you actually have is, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or what you actually have is, a an acute disease or illness or something like that, or what you actually have is another chronic condition that has nothing to do with, the adrenal glands or hormones at all. I think that can be really problematic because people then take longer to get diagnosed, spend more time suffering, end up with, further progressed disease that might be harder to manage and alleviate symptoms for when they finally do get help. And so, it creates needless suffering, I think, to give people this false hope and these false diagnoses. And, it often does come from a good place. I think providers in the wellness space often want to do right by their clients, want to help people who aren't being served by conventional healthcare. And I really understand and empathize with that. And I think it's really important to give people true information. And, a lot of these spaces, these wellness spaces, people get really caught up in this idea of like cutting edge research or like, the hot new science or whatever. But I think to me, another word for like cutting edge is like not really ready for prime time or not really ready for being used to make clinical decisions, because a lot of this early stage research is like from cell cultures or from animal studies or maybe from studies in humans that are not randomized and controlled. And so the people who are, taking a supplement or doing a particular practice are going to be really different than the types of people who are not. And those differences are what really make the difference in people's outcomes and not so much, the product or practice that they're using. So I think just being like all of us, from consumers to providers, being aware of how early stage science can be sort of twisted to justify recommendations that aren't necessarily in people's best interest. And even if you really want to kind of experiment with yourself or, offer patients experimental advice, and experimental like things that aren't really backed up by robust randomized controlled trials and long-term data, being just open with people about the kind of risks that they're taking on with that. And, as a client or a practitioner or a person who's pursuing wellness, being really mindful of the fact that the risks are great and the unknowns are huge. And, you may think that there's no harm in trying because you haven't gotten, what you needed in the conventional healthcare system. And so what's the harm in trying something that's it's just food or it's just supplements or whatever. And it seems like it's gentle and it's not going to be a problem. But in fact, oftentimes these things have even greater risks, in some cases than the conventional methods they're meant to replace, or then, the disease itself, perhaps even like things can be made a lot worse with the wrong interventions.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to come back to the point you made about how polarizing the two approaches can be, right? Like you say, when we're not getting what we need from conventional medicine and we travel down the wellness path, I found myself, at least when I did that, then it was almost like I rejected traditional medicine fully and wouldn't listen to anything that they had to say and believed it was all crap. And I put all of my eggs in the basket of wellness, right? And like you say, and then people are missing out or potentially not being diagnosed with serious illnesses because they're rejecting the traditional medicine. It's so polarizing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so
Totally.
I was going to ask, and I think you answered the question around how does somebody know if what they're doing is a healthy pursuit of health or if they've fallen into the trap and it's become disordered. And I think what I heard you say is it's when we are coming at it from a place of fear, right? When we start to fear foods and fear
Mm-hmm.
treatment. Would you agree?
I think that's one thing. Yeah, for sure. I think if you start to see that you are thinking in really black and white ways, fearing foods, fearing conventional medicine, if you find yourself sounding a bit like a conspiracy theorist, I think that's always a good sign to kind of like take a pause, take stock of sort of what it is you're believing and allowing to hold sway in your mind. And not to say that like everything that sounds like a conspiracy theory is wrong. I mean, there are genuine conspiracies out there too. But I think when it comes to something like, belief that all conventional healthcare is wrong and bad, or all pharmaceuticals are bad because because big pharma is only out for profit and they're just trying to harm people for profit or something like that. That's a sign that I think it's gone really far. It's gone to an extreme place, and to maybe temper some of your thinking about that, because I know how it is. I know how it feels to be dismissed and unheard and not empathized with and made to feel like things are all in your head by conventional doctors. And that sucks and it's awful and nobody should have to go through it. And I have found some really great empathetic care providers out there many years later after a lot of, trial and error and research and thankfully insurance coverage. And I think, that's something that not everybody has the luxury to afford, or even if they do have insurance coverage, they don't necessarily have, the ability to afford the copays needed to go from doctor to doctor and like find the right person. So I get how tempting it is to look for self-help methods online or look to wellness culture practices, but I think just remembering that wellness culture is not innocent in all of this. Wellness providers may and oftentimes this does happen that they're sort of playing on fear of conventional medicine and taking real shortcomings with the conventional healthcare system or with the pharmaceutical industry and using that as leverage to shoehorn in their own beliefs and kind of to manipulate people in some cases. And so to realize that just because someone is making some good points about the problems with the conventional healthcare system doesn't mean that the alternative they're offering is necessarily any better. And in fact, the wellness industry is a huge global $4.4 trillion industry. There's, a massive amount of money in supplements, in diets, in, alternative medicine, integrative and functional medicine. Like these are industries too. This is not some, sort of grassroots thing that is like a real alternative necessarily to conventional healthcare. And even if it was more grassroots, I think there's always, people always are out for themselves in some way, right? Like there's sort of like profit motive in a lot of industries, including the wellness industry. And so, plus the wellness industry doesn't have the kind of safeguards that conventional medicine does in a lot of ways. So even as problematic as the pharmaceutical industry is, at least pharmaceutical drugs do have to be approved for safety and efficacy before going to market in the US. And that's not the case with supplements. They don't have to be approved for safety and efficacy. Like supplement companies can put any drug they want on the market, right? And they really are drugs in some cases. Like literally, sometimes they include pharmaceuticals in them. There's unlabeled pharmaceutical drugs in some supplements. And you wouldn't know it's there unless, someone decides to do a sample, right? Sometimes scientists will do some random sampling and find really interesting things in supplements that are on the market. Or they can be, adulterated with other things like amphetamine-like chemicals, or just include a lot less or a lot more of what they say on the label, or think, other ingredients that aren't on the label. So just knowing that, not to like strike fear in people's hearts about supplements necessarily, but just to say that they're often sort of pitted as this panacea and this alternative to pharmaceuticals. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they're even less regulated and less safe than pharmaceuticals are. And so, same thing goes for diets, really. To me, like if you're being recommended a diet as this supposedly gentle, safe alternative, but it's making you obsess about food, it's making you go back to eating disorder behaviors or start having new ones, start becoming obsessed with your weight or with, the quality of food or calories or something like that when you didn't have those kinds of fixations before, that's a huge red flag too. I think some other red flags are just things not having good scientific evidence behind them. And you can sometimes see that when they sort of will, claims will be made to say, like, this is cutting edge science, or this is based on such and such research. And here's a link, and you click through and it doesn't even address what it purports to address. It doesn't uphold the claim that, the person was making. There's nothing in the study that seems like it's remotely related to what they were saying. Like, that's a huge red flag too. So I think doing a little bit of that research on who is this person? What are their credentials to be making these claims? What's the supposed evidence they're basing the claims on? Is that, supposed evidence base really true? Like going right to the source and seeing, does this say what it purports to say, right? Is there actually solid evidence backing up these claims? Or is this person sort of inventing things out of whole cloth, or, taking like one small piece of an idea, but kind of neglecting all of the other context around it? All of that I think is really important. And that requires, getting off of social media, getting off of the website of the person or the email of the person who's trying to sell you the thing, and sort of looking at the context, the broader context around that person or that claim.
Yeah, I was going to say it requires a lot more time to independently research these claims that you're reading about, right? You can't take anything at face value.
Right.
But that's our responsibility as consumers to do that independent and look at both sides.
And honestly, it shouldn't be like we don't have the time to really be doing that. So I think there need to be policy changes and systemic changes. And, I talk about that in the book as sort of like the first line of defense against this, actually, that should be the first line of defense. And I think we need changes in the way social media is regulated so that mis and disinformation can't be spread like they are. I think we need changes to the way the supplement industry is regulated, to the way wellness providers are regulated, to make sure that these claims can't proliferate as they do. But I think in, the absence of that, right, or while waiting and working towards that, people need to not necessarily like take all, because I know we all don't have time for that. And even I sometimes will come across something and I'm like, I just don't have time to research this. But to me now, like from where I stand now, having gone through all I have with my chronic illnesses and, thankfully getting good care for most of them, although sometimes still feeling dismissed and unheard and, having things that are just like, we don't really know what's going on with your body, the position I'm in now is to say, if I don't know about something and I don't have time to research it, I generally put in the probably doesn't work, not going to try it bucket instead of the let me try this and see what happens bucket, And I mean, sometimes I get hooked too. Like I talked about on my podcast recently that I had fertility treatments to have my daughter. And, one of the things they offered was this like laser acupuncture, which, they said had science behind it. And I didn't really have time to do a deep dive. And I was like, okay, well, it's, I'm in for a penny and for a pound. It costs a little bit more money, but we've already spent so much money on these fertility treatments anyway. What's, whatever, 100 more or something. So let me just go ahead and do it. And, now I'm like, oh, I kind of got duped. I don't think there was good evidence behind that, actually, now that I've had a little bit of time to do the research. But, we all kind of get caught, I think, in those moments. But if we can see it sooner and sort of like notice if we're going down that path, especially if it's something related to diet and, cutting out foods or things like that, if we can start to notice a little bit more quickly, oh, here, I'm doing that thing again, like, yep, there's not really good evidence behind this, or who's this person trying to sell me this? Like, let's get off their Instagram and go do an actual search and see who they are. Oh, they're a known, conspiracist, or they're, lumped together with these anti-vax entrepreneurs, or they just, maybe they're a decent person, but they don't seem to have any sort of medical credential whatsoever. And yet they're making all these health claims. Like, okay, like now I know that's a red flag and I'm moving on.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, then let's give our listeners some tips that they can use. So what are some tangible recommendations you would make to people who want to prioritize well-being without getting sucked down into the trap?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think, again, first and foremost are these systemic ways of addressing the issue. But as an individual, I think, there are definitely things we can do to first, like try to approach integrative and alternative and, functional and wellness culture in general with as much critical thinking and skepticism as you would conventional medicine. Not just taking at face value, oh, they're alternatives, so it's better, right? And with any given wellness treatment or practice, just know that there's going to be a placebo effect. There's going to be probably some feeling better at first. But if you find yourself then not knowing or feeling like maybe I feel worse, maybe I feel better, or maybe I have some new symptoms I didn't have before, just recognizing that as like part of the process and not as something that means it's your fault or that you have to, do extra things and, keep cutting out more foods or adding more supplements or anything like that. It just means that the placebo effect wore off, probably. Trying to take a step back from social media, I think, is a huge one. Not looking to that for your health and wellness advice, and recognizing how the algorithms might suck you in a lot deeper than you actually intended to, and seeing if you can take a step back from that and just, spend some time figuring out what actually feels good to you. There's a method I like called SIFT, which was developed by Mike Caulfield, who's a researcher at the University of Washington studying media literacy. And SIFT stands for 4 steps. So it's stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media back to the original context. And so what that can look like in terms of wellness culture is like stop, just take a breath and don't share, don't act, don't click buy. Even if you're sharing content to say, look at this terrible misinformation, that spreads the misinformation to your audience, and you never know who in your network is going to be vulnerable. So, try to sit on your hands and not do anything with it, and think of it as like you're quarantining the misinformation. You're not letting it spread. Investigate the source means like looking into who's sharing the content, who stands to benefit, what are their credentials, what's their expertise, do they seem to be someone who has a reason for making the claims they're making based on like really sound credentials. Just because they're selling something doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong or spreading misinformation, but knowing that they're selling something, I think, is helpful to take into account to see like where they might be coming from and what they might be pushing, as opposed to some of the other evidence that's out there. Find better coverage or find other coverage means not necessarily staying with the original source of the information. So again, it's like getting off the social media page, getting off the, wellness website where you're hearing about this claim, and investigating where reputable sources are talking about this kind of thing. So, if you have the time, and again, who does these days, but, just doing a quick search on pubmed.gov for scientific evidence, if they say like, oh, there's all this science behind such and such a thing. I had a conversation with someone recently where they were like, I thought there was science behind like cold showers. And I was like, I don't really think so. And I did a quick PubMed search, and it was like, yeah, no, it's the evidence that is there says basically it's largely a placebo.
Really?
And so, yeah, like, whatever it is, whatever sort of claim that's being made, if you throw it into PubMed and refine your search by looking at just randomized controlled trials, or better yet, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, you can really see like what the quality of the evidence actually is behind some claims. There's a lot more to scientific literacy that we could go into as well, but I think, that's just for quick sifting through. You don't even necessarily have to go to PubMed. You can just, click through or do a Google search for the supposed study they're citing, or look up what, reputable medical organizations and reputable mainstream media have to say about a claim. I think there's been a lot of missteps in some cases by media outlets, by medical organizations, especially early in the pandemic when kind of nobody knew what was really going on, and a lot of different things were getting reported. But I think overall, those organizations still have a really strong incentive to get things right and to correct the record and to keep evolving their knowledge and awareness of things. And, speaking as someone who's been a health journalist for 20 years, like I have always been, and, especially back in the day when I was really bought into wellness culture, which I think a lot of health journalists are, I was really excited and interested in any new science or evidence that came out about a particular, claim, like, oh, such and such can cure cancer or can prevent, illness or, prolong your life or something like that. And so you do get a lot of these headlines that are like, chocolate can add 20 years to your life or whatever it might be, which is just silly. But that's actually kind of good evidence that if there really were a cure for cancer that was not, that was quote unquote natural, or if there really were, miracle properties to something that's being claimed online, mainstream media probably would be all over it because they really want to be first. They want to get those scoops. They want to have the health information to share and spread. And then finally, the T in SIFT is trace claims, quotes, and media back to their original context. So that just means, again, if there is any sort of citation, looking into that, looking into the original study and just making sure that it says what it purports to say, or whether it's something totally, unapplicable to, human health. Like if it was a study done in cells or done on lab animals or in a very small number of humans, or not randomized controlled trials, those are all red flags that this isn't something to really take seriously. And then finally, I think another important thing to take note of, sort of if you get through if you get through a quick SIFT check and you're still feeling sort of emotionally hung up on a particular claim and you're like, it's hard to let it go. I think recognizing that, those strong emotions that come up for you when you're absorbing content can be evidence of potential manipulation afoot or potential misinformation if you're not able to verify the facts. So if something provokes strong emotions in you and you can't verify the facts, that's a potential sign that you're being, sort of your fear or your anxiety or your desire for hope or desire for help and healing is being preyed upon or being leveraged to sell something.
Such an important point, right? Because in a lot of situations, we feel very desperate to feel better, right? And we want these claims that are being made to be true, and we want to experience the healing that they promise. And yeah, so there can be a very strong emotional reaction when you go looking for validation and you don't find it. That's a really good point to bring up.
And yeah, being compassionate with yourself when that happens, if you do start to look into something and you find that it really isn't backed up by good evidence, oftentimes that feels really bad, especially if you've been pursuing the thing or you've had a provider who told you to do it and, not being able to verify those claims yourself can make you feel like really alone and really adrift. And like the thing that you had a lot of hope for now isn't isn't passing muster. So giving yourself compassion for that and just trying to take some time to really feel whatever you feel, whatever grief comes up, whatever anger, whatever, denial or bargaining or all the stages of grief, right? And recognizing that is a part of the process too, and that you might feel, defensive at times. You might argue with people who question your beliefs or your practices, but to kind of keep the dialogue open with other people and with yourself as well. And to recognize that even if something is, turns out to be wrong, turns out to be misinformation, you were doing the best you could. You were trying to get help. You were desperate perhaps for healing. And so it's understandable if you get sucked into these wellness traps. I think we all do at some level.
Yeah, it's easy to do, right? Because the belief is out there that we can achieve perfect health if we just do everything right. And I mean, the unfortunate reality is there are no guarantees. There are no promises of perfect health. And sometimes that's really uncomfortable to sit with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The acceptance of having to have, ways that we feel suboptimal or ways that we maybe are always going to have to be managing a condition is really hard. I know for me, it took years to really accept that a lot of these chronic conditions I have, I'm going to have for the rest of my life. And I'm probably going to be managing them in some way and like might need more care than other people. And I might not be able to do everything other people can do. And that's hard. And, it really sucks sometimes when you see other people kind of being spontaneous and having fun in ways that you don't feel like you can. And, I know that for me, it's good self-care to just keep accepting those limitations for myself and keep doing the things I know to do for self-care. And to not, get too caught up in these promises of like reversing disease or, feeling like I did before I had any of these conditions. Cause that's just oftentimes false hope.
Like you say, it's about offering yourself compassion, being kind and accepting and respectful to yourself, even if you're not 100% thrilled with what you have to live with, right? You're
Hmm.
still worthy of that same kindness and compassion.
Exactly.
Well, Christy, this has been a really informative and valuable conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I have one
Thank
final
you for
question.
having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's a pleasure. One final question that I ask all my guests, and it's a quick one. What does joyful movement mean to you?
Such a good one. I think it means like the kind of movement that just speaks to me in any moment. And, for me now, that often looks like playing with my daughter, going outside for a walk with her, or, chasing her around or something like that. Sometimes it's, more in response to like something my body is asking for. Like if my back is really hurting, things are feeling really tight. I'm like, yeah, yoga, I think would be joyful because it would, open up these areas. It would help relieve pain. It would help me feel better. And that's what I want right now. So just sort of being aware of like the ways that my body's asking to move. And maybe that's just, I mean, like as soon as I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I need to like move my shoulder in this way or, loosen up my neck and things like that. Right. Like if just asking yourself that question sometimes I think brings up like little ways that your body is asking for movement that can feel really great. And I think that it doesn't, joy, I think, takes a lot of forms, right? I've been thinking about the phrase all joy and no fun in regards to parenting, because
Mm.
I actually think I have a lot of fun with my daughter and stuff. But like, the some of the day-to-day grind of being a parent is not super fun, but like there
Uh-huh.
is this deep joy that comes from it. And, I think that can be sometimes the same with movement. Maybe certainly I'm not comparing the joy of movement to the joy of parenting, but there is a sort of joy in just like taking care of yourself and in feeling better, and the grind of like having to do certain types of movement or stretching, or like I've had to do physical therapy for certain things in the past, and that's not fun. So it's like joy doesn't always equal fun necessarily, but I think it's sort of like working towards feeling better in your body and just feeling more at ease.
Mm, that is the perfect definition. Maybe we could co-write a book on that someday.
Yeah. Let's talk for sure.
Okay. I'll have my people call you.
Amazing.
Thanks so much for being on the show, Christy. Can you tell our listeners again where they can find your book and where they can keep in touch with you after they listen to this episode?
Yeah, absolutely. So my new book is called The Wellness Trap. You can find that wherever you get your books, in local bookstores or online. You can go to my website, christyharrison.com/the wellness trap to order it there. And then I also have two podcasts of my own. I have one that's the new one that I'm currently producing called Rethinking Wellness, that is available wherever you're listening to this. And it's also on Substack, where I do a newsletter companion to it as well. And there's like bonus content for paid subscribers, and you can get that at rethinkingwellness.substack.com. And then my first podcast is called Food Psych, and there's 10 years worth of content. Well, I actually took a couple seasons off, so it's probably 8 years worth of content there, that you can also get wherever you're listening to this.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into the Power in Motion podcast today. If you love what you're learning here, then I invite you to take the next step of embodying these concepts into your own life so that you can live your healthiest, happiest life and never again feel held back by your body. Coaching is the fastest, most efficient pathway to taking what you know in your head to actually applying it and seeing results. Whether you're looking to make changes around movement, food, body image, or all three, I'm here to help you nurture a kind, respectful, and trusting relationship with your body so you can feel your very best. Click the link in the show notes to book a free consultation, and together we'll uncover what's getting in the way of you having the results you want. You'll leave this call knowing exactly what you need to work on, and together we'll explore whether one of my coaching offers is a good fit for you. I can't wait to meet you.